truth is entrepreneurs are the sun, investors are the moon. So investors are only reflected light relative to entrepreneurs. And it's easy to get this turned around and say, oh, well, capital allocation is the main thing, but it's not. Building the thing is the main thing.
Hello and welcome to the Tech Overflow podcast. My name is Hugh Williams, and we are the podcast that explains technology to curious people. You're probably wondering where Hannah is. Well, the good news is Hannah is about to join us with another great interview. This time she's talking to John Lilly. And John Lilly was a venture capitalist. Now he's doing angel investing, plenty of board work, teaching, and he's just announced that he's taking on a role at Gigascale, which is a brand new investment firm that's focusing on climate and climate technology. And we'll learn a little bit more about that in the show. So let's join Hannah and John as they get into a great conversation.
John Lilly, welcome to Tech Overflow.
I'm glad to be here, Hannah. Thanks for having me.
We're so excited to have you. Okay, so for our curious listeners, can you explain in simple terms what an investor does in practice?
Well, yeah, I can explain what venture capital is. That's my sort of area of the world. VC, venture capital, is a very Silicon Valley and now global phenomenon, but it's been around for, I don't know, probably the 40s or 50s when Bessemer and Greylock and some others started, and they really got to prominence in the 80s and 90s with the rise of Apple and Amazon. But the idea is that you try to invest, usually a few $100,000 to a few $1 million in very, very early stage companies, almost always technology companies or something new, technology that's enabling something new. And you're trying to turn, $10 million into $10 billion. It's not a super complicated idea. You're doing, adventure risk. You're putting money at risk that banks, it started because banks wouldn't fund things like Intel and Fairchild, which are really the genesis of a lot of the early investments. They were made in Silicon Valley. Okay,
so if you are trying to get those big wins that you described, but you're taking lots of risk, as you also laid out, presumably you're not expecting a 100% success rate there.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's why they call it venture capital. And it's changed over the years, but it used to be, you'd spend months with a company and they say, okay, well, I think they've got this new chip process like Intel or Fairchild did. Or, Sequoia, who famously did one of the first rounds of Apple, had a memo about, oh, well, we've got this interesting young guy. He's kind of brash, Steve Jobs. He's in Steve Wozniak, and they built this thing, but I don't know if it's going to work or not. But if they're pretty smart and we have to, pay a lot to be a part of it, but it might work. And so a lot of times you're doing things that banks or other kinds of capital wouldn't support and public markets wouldn't do because they look kind of crazy. When we invested in Instagram, by the time we did that, it was obvious to me that it was going to be a big company, but Kevin came in and he's like, look, what if you could point at any point on the globe and see what's happening right there, right now with pictures taken by just normal humans? And he was really clear that that was the vision of what was going to exist in the world. He could see it, but it sounded ridiculous for
What year was that? Just to give us a place in time.
Well, we invested in probably 2013. We wired the check 4 days before they got bought by Facebook. So by the time we invested, they were adding a million users a day. And then Mark, invited Kevin over to his house and didn't let him go until they signed a deal. But I just use it as an example. It's the same, Airbnb when they came in and they said, look, we think there's going to be a business where people are not going to go to hotels anymore and everybody's going to sleep on somebody else's couch. And to, talking to a bunch of pretty wealthy guys that are investing in a room, they're like, that sounds bad. Why would we do that? But Brian Chesky presented and Reid Hoffman said, no, look, it's working. Whether we do it or not, Reid's well, it sounds kind of interesting. And whether I would do it or not, maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't, but we can see in the data that they've already given us, this looks like it might work. And so a lot of times, things look like they won't work and they do. Mostly they don't. And so most companies fail and it's just the truth of it. And so you invest and you're like, well, there's a lot of things we don't know. We really like the founder. We think she's amazing. Or we really think that everyone in the world, since they've got phones, they're going to want stuff to do on it. And so let's go find things like Twitter or Facebook to do on it. And so it's all over the map, but you kind of go in assuming that what's going to be hard, the status quo exists this way because a lot of people are making money on the status quo. And so you're trying to upset that because of some new technology or some new capability or some new idea. And most things don't work, but the things that work almost always are very spectacular in the way they work. So
it's crazy when you make Instagram or Airbnb sound like it was the sort of rogue challenger idea, because both of those things are so instilled in the public consciousness now. It's amazing how quickly things can change. But I guess the key takeaway there is, if you assume only a small proportion of those investments are really turning out, you cast the net wide purposefully, but probably quite wide. And then it's a high risk portfolio with a small conversion rate per company, but you hope for a large conversion of your investment overall.
Yeah, I mean, we should talk about stages of capital, like there's seed stage and institutional capital and that kind of stuff over time. But like for a venture capitalist, what you do is you go raise money from what are called limited partners, LPs. And you as a venture capitalist are what's called a general partner. A general partnership might be 4 or 5 partners that are making investments with some associates and some other staff. So a team of recruiters or marketers or things like that. And then they might have raised money, so call it $250 million or $500 million or $1 billion. And so that's the fund. And they raise that from limited partners. And so limited partners are anyone from like big institutions like the Yale and Harvard and Stanford endowments to corporate venture funds to high net worth individuals who are putting in 5 or 10 or $50 million into the fund to invest. But the idea is that these limited partners, they say, well, we're going to give you this fund, $1 billion, and you're going to try to invest that over 3 or 4 years, depending on the circumstance. And you might invest that across 40 companies, say. So 40 companies, and you got $1 billion. And the idea is that in 7 to 10 years, you want to get back $3 billion or $4 billion or $5 billion against that billion. So you might 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 exit. And it's all over the map. Like a lot of funds don't return, and like you really want to be in the top quartile because there's a real difference between high performing funds and most funds. And in a portfolio of 40 or 50 companies, people say it's a power law distribution. So most of the companies will give you your money back, 1x. A lot of companies will return 0. And then in any fund, you're hoping for 2 or 3 companies that will return the whole fund. So if the fund's $1 billion and you invest $50 million in a company, you're hoping that 2 or 3 of these companies each give you back more than $1 billion. Bill Gurley from Benchmark famously said, you can only lose your money one time, but you can make multiples on each investment. So you might be able to make 10 or 100 times on a company, but you can only lose what you put in. It's asymmetric return, and that's the whole thing that makes it possible.
So it sounds like a lot lies in the sourcing and having an eye for a great investment, which I know helped you spot Figma, and maybe we can talk about that one a little bit later. But how do you spot a future winner, or, think you've spotted a future winner? They may not all be as you've outlined. Like, is it all about the founders? You mentioned an early Steve Jobs earlier when we were talking. Is it all about a Steve Jobs, or is it sometimes about a Steve Jobs or a Steve Jobs plus an iPhone or something?
Well, I think it's a lot of different ways. There's no one way to do it. There's lots of ways to win. And because of this power law, you only have to be right a few times to be a really, really good investor and have really good returns for your fund. You can be wrong a lot and be right a few times and still be excellent. My former partner, David Z. Greylock, famously invested in Facebook and Roblox and others. He used to say, look, the job is you need to see all the interesting companies and entrepreneurs that are starting. You need to win the right to invest in them. You need to decide whether you want to invest in them, and then you need to help them build a company. And you're talking about sourcing. So every investor is different in this way. For me, I'm technical by background. I went to Stanford. I've lived here in Silicon Valley for a long time. And I just try to be around the most interesting people I can. So with Instagram, for example, I just noticed my friends using Instagram. And in particular, I noticed a professional photographer friend of mine using it. And he has these amazing photos. He's like an underwater digital photographer. Before that was really very common. And what I noticed is that he started distributing his photos to us, all his friends over Instagram, which was funny because at the time, Instagram was like this basically filters. And so you put a filter on and make any photo look kind of artsy with a filter. And I'm like, Eric, why are you doing this? Because like your photos are super high quality, and Instagram's like for sharing photos that aren't very high quality. And he's like, well, I'm using it because it helps me connect to my networks over Facebook and Twitter and all these, makes it easy to get them out to all the people. That was a signal for me. Oh, well, because he's doing this way, like it may be more relevant to lots and lots of people. And so then I started sort of chasing Instagram and trying to get in front of Kevin and Mike, the founders, and eventually started interacting with Kevin and trying to help him along the way. But that one was more like, well, I noticed a thing in the wild that people were using. Let's try to hook onto it and figure out how to get connected up. And we did, and we invested in Instagram eventually. Figma was different. So Figma, I got a note from 3 people in a weekend. DJ Patil, he coined the term data science. He worked at LinkedIn for a long time. He was the U.S. chief data scientist for a long time. Jeff Weiner, who's the former CEO of LinkedIn, and another person. They said, "Look, you got to meet this kid, Dylan." And they all said kid because he was 20. And so I met him. I met him over a weekend, and I didn't invest then. We can talk about that story and how that unfolded in a little bit. But for that situation, it was like everybody said, "Go meet this guy." For Kevin and Mike, it was like, "Here's an app, super interesting. Let's go do it." I teach at Stanford a lot, which is where my background is. And sometimes people say, "Hey, John, I saw you teach. Can I talk to you about my startup?" And we do that. You want to be as broad as you can to just see as much as you can. Seeing is the first step. And sometimes it's the hardest because you don't know what percentage of the world's interesting stuff you're seeing at any given time.
Okay. So I love this. It's see, decide, win, and build.
Yeah. And this was super hard for me because I'm an engineer by background. And so for me, I want to see a problem and then I want to I want to understand it. So I'm going to ask a ton of questions and figure out how to do it. And then I can start to think about how to solve the problem. So for an engineer, it would be I want to see the thing, then I want to decide whether I like it, then I want to win it, then I want to go build it. And this is the hardest thing for me as a VC was that really the orders flipped. Because if you talk to an entrepreneur and you want to totally understand things before you decide whether you're interested, what the entrepreneur is going to infer from that conversation is oh, you may not believe everything. Because the act of entrepreneurship is fundamentally I'm going to go change the world. I'm going to do this thing. Nobody's ever done it before and nobody can see it except for me. And so what happens when you're an entrepreneur and you start a company is that everyone tells you you're an idiot for years. They say, well, this is stupid and this won't work. And this is why this has never happened before. And so entrepreneurs, at some level, you're just looking for somebody else who believes, who can see it. And so when an entrepreneur is pitching a VC, if the VC comes back and says, well, what about this? And what about this? And this seems wrong. An entrepreneur is yeah, no kidding. I haven't figured all this stuff out. So I'm going to go find somebody who can see what might go right as opposed to all the things that might go wrong. And so for me, I had to kind of start to flip it around. So maybe just believe that the entrepreneur is right and awesome. And then just make sure I can do enough stuff so that they want to work with me. And then we can get into it. We can figure out whether it's a match and whether it's a good fit for how I work and how they work and that kind of stuff.
Okay. So in that first stage of seeing, sometimes that comes via noticing a product like you mentioned for Instagram. And often that comes from just being out there talking to people. And maybe you get behind a founder because they have an incredible vision and a sort of je ne sais quoi that you just know they'll do something great. And then I imagine there's a spectrum in between where they're pretty compelling and you've seen their product and it looks pretty good. So it sounds quite instinctive, actually, although there's a lot hanging in that instinct.
Yeah, I would say that when you start, you're using data as much as you can to try to figure out where to look, where to see, who's interesting, that kind of stuff. You use judgment, I think, in the middle. And then I think you use data. Once you say, I think this is the right thing to do, then you try to go use data that might tell you why you're wrong. You're not looking for confirmatory data so much as you're looking for try to tell you why you're wrong. So I think there's this data sandwich. Use data at the beginning and the end, but a lot of it's judgment in the middle. The numbers, after my first year of being a VC, I think I saw 600 companies my first year as a VC, and I invested in 4.
Wow. That's a lot. 4 is a lot.
4 is a lot. Yeah. At a firm like Greylock where I was, you're taking a board seat for everyone. You're writing a multi-million-dollar check for every company, and you're going to be on the journey with these companies for 5 or 10 years each. And so if you add 2 or 3 or 4 a year, pretty quickly you're on 15 or 20 boards, which is too many. And so 4 was a lot, especially for my first year to do. I did Tumblr and Dropbox and a couple others.
Just a few companies you might have heard of, guys.
Well, they were not garage startups by then. I was doing a little bit later stage in those companies, but yeah, Tumblr and Dropbox both did very well and continue to be in the world. But that means that for 600 companies, I invested in 4. I probably seriously looked at 8, and I probably did follow-up meetings with 40 or 50 where I took 2 meetings. And then for like 530 companies, I had 50 minutes with them start to finish and a follow-up email or follow-up conversation. So it's a lot. And I think that a lot of it's pattern recognition, which I think works for you sometimes when your markets are consistent, and it works against you sometimes when markets are chaotic like they are now. But yeah, it's a lot of judgment.
Okay, so we've touched a lot on see and decide. I was interested by what you said about Instagram, where you came across the app, you chatted to your photographer friend about it, and then you said that you were the one trying to get in touch with the founders. So that speaks, is that what you mean by win the right to invest? Like obviously if someone comes knocking on your door, they're looking for your investment, but if you're really scanning things, sometimes it might work the other way.
Well, Kevin and Mike, like, so they started Instagram. They got funded by Benchmark and Andreessen, and they were growing. And it was kind of like, it was clearly working, but they were still very small. It was like 11 people, something like that. And so I met with Kevin and Mike, and we got along. They're Stanford guys too, and we had a lot of background and friends in common. And so they were easy to talk to, product people like me. And we talked, but they said, what we really need is a DevOps engineer. We really need somebody to help us keep these servers up because things are going great. I did what I could to get them more interested. So I said, hey, do you want to meet Reid Hoffman or David Z? David invested in Facebook, Reid, founder of LinkedIn. But they said, yeah, well, that's cool. We like David, we like Reid, we like you, but we really need is an engineer. And so one of the people who was working at Greylock at the time was a guy named Dan Portillo, who I worked with at Mozilla and before that as well. And he was a recruiter for us, and he found him a guy. So they had been looking for this person for like over a year. And Dan said, I think here's a perfect person. I think you should talk to him. And they ended up hiring him. I think he was employee number 12 or 13 at Instagram. But then Kevin eventually called and said, okay, we're raising now, and I want to talk to you guys. I want to talk about the raise. And the reason really was we helped him recruit a person.
Interesting. Okay, so it's, I imagine, sometimes quite a long process, but it's all about building that rapport, building the relationship in creative ways as well, as you said.
Well, right. And so, we talked about the Figma story too. So Figma, I met Dylan when it was really just Dylan and his co-founder, Evan, and 2 other people. He came to a coffee shop near my house and on a Saturday and gave me a demo. And he was probably 20, 21 years old. And he was showing me something working in a web browser because I previously run Mozilla, made Firefox, and I have fairly deep experience in web technology. And he just wanted to show me this graphics thing, kind of like Photoshop working in the browser. And it was amazing. And I said, that's amazing. And it's incredible that you guys did this. And I love that you're using a brand new technology that we worked on Mozilla, and like it's just been possible. So that's all really cool. But I don't think this is a business. So I love you. I think this is awesome. However, not for me to invest. And so I passed. So I think I hurt Dylan's feelings because he's expecting the Mozilla guy to say, this is incredible. How can I be involved? And I wasn't, but I was impressed with him. And he said, okay, well, that's a bummer, but can we have breakfast next month? Because I just want to see if we can chat about some stuff. I said, of course, I'll spend whatever time you want. And because you're an interesting guy, you're doing interesting stuff. And so we had breakfast, and we'd go in, we'd have stuff to talk about, and we'd always come out with a longer list than we had going in of new things to talk about. And he'd say, can we do this again in 6 weeks? And it's like, okay, sure, let's do that. And we just liked being around each other and like talking about technology and product. And then eventually he said, well, I've got something new I want to show you. And he showed it to me. And it was more interesting because it's more like what Figma is today. But I just learned to like him and trust his judgment. And then I noticed all the things he did to follow up. So there'd be times when he'd say, well, what do you think about this? I'm like, well, I don't know an answer to that, but I think you should go talk to this person. Former CEO of Adobe, like a guy named, I mentioned one time, Bruce Chizen. And like 6 weeks later, when I had breakfast with Dylan, he's like, okay, I talked to Bruce. Here's what he said. I'm like, well, how did you get to Bruce? He's like, well, I asked this person and this person and this person. And I just really loved his grit and his determination and his follow through and his non-defensiveness. And so for that one, we just built a relationship up over a year and a half. By the time we did the A, it made just it's obvious we should work together.
But I imagine that the founders that pique your interest have a similar set of qualities that you've just mentioned. And they're fairly intuitive when you reel them off like that, like grit, determination, but then non-defensiveness. Like that all sounds like the kind of person that you'd want to back. But then I guess thinking more about that build phase, who you can sort of critique and work with to grow something.
Yeah, that's right. And so partly it's a fit issue. So like there are companies that I didn't invest in that have gotten huge, and they'd come in and they'd pitch and they were clearly talented. And I just like, I don't think I can do it. I'm not I'm not transactional in this way, or I don't match, or like I like asking product questions and they don't like getting product questions asked. And so to his internal credit, I mentioned to Reed one time, there's a company that got very big, a consumer company that we could have invested in the A and we didn't, because I sent a mail to Reed. It's like, look, I had this meeting and I think this thing might work, but man, I do not get along with the founders. I just don't think I can do it, even though I think it might make us money. And, Reed's point is like, look, the job is not to be in every interesting company. The job is to be in enough interesting companies to provide really good return to your investors. So if it's not a fit, that's okay. Just find other good things that are a fit.
Wow, that is so interesting, because the chemistry is as important as the product. And it sounds like he was saying to you, you can get comfortable with saying no to something and it ending up feeling like a miss because it just wasn't right for you.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, there's some things that you need that have such velocity that you really have to pay attention to and like work through your feelings. There are the things that could work, but like maybe are just better for other investors to do. Reed was perfect for Brian Chesky and Airbnb, and he was just such a good match and such a good advisor and confidant. Reed was perfect for Sam Altman when they started OpenAI. And Reed would not have been as good at companies like mine, so like with Figma and that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think the fit between a founder and an investor is a big deal because it's a very trust-oriented relationship. So over time, you try to be useful to the entrepreneur so that they call you whether things on good days, they call you on bad days, and that's the main thing.
Well, and I imagine the hope is that they call you on the bad days, maybe more than they call you on the good days if you've got capital at risk you want to know.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that at some level you try to forget about the capital. So at some level you're trying to say, look, I'm in the boat with the founder. I'm in the boat with the company. I'm part of the company. And yes, I have capital that I put in. I'm trying to turn it into more capital, but really I'm part of the team. That's how I work, at least. Not everybody's just, other people are like, well, let's just put money in and let the entrepreneur run. That's not really how I work the best. I like to be involved.
And thinking specifically, John, about your involvement as an investor, you have a background in computer science, which I presume is super useful when you're investing in tech companies. So I guess I have a couple of questions. One is like, how much do you think you lean on that? And as a follow-up, like, are all good investors people who understand the technical nuts and bolts?
So I don't know if it's useful or not, is the actual truth. As to how I lean on it, I only know one way to be, and it's to be me. And I'm an engineer, and I think like this stuff. Some of the world's best investors are not deep technically. Reed was a symbolic systems at Stanford, which is in a philosophy major at Oxford. And so like, he's like not as technical, certainly not a computer scientist. Mike Moritz was a journalist, wrote the book about Disney before becoming a VC. I think lots of people are bankers, very successful. And so I think being a good investor doesn't depend on you being technical. I think it does depend on you being curious and interested and wondering about what's true that you may not think is true yet. And so I think curiosity is the main thing. I personally am interested in the technology, so I fall back and I ask interesting questions about how things work and that kind of stuff. But I'm not sure that's the most relevant thing for whether a venture is going to be successful or not.
And investors who don't have any technical background, or at least like not, they might be technically adept in finance, right? Which I'm sure is really helpful. But if it was an ex-banker, would they have like a tech team in-house to help them understand some of the sort of product implications or the engineering challenges? Because that must be pretty prevalent when it comes to the conversations that you need to have with a tech founder.
Yeah, depending on the company, things may or may not, well, maybe more technical depending on what part of the sector you're investing in, that kind of stuff. Code is getting a bit less important now with the advent of AI and cloud code and that kind of stuff. But I would say that it's hard to have a technical team in-house that would be broad enough and deep enough. And so what you end up having is lots of friends. And so you end up trying to develop relationships just like in your sourcing, which is like you're trying to develop relationships with high taste engineers and high taste technical people who you can call and say, hey, do you know about quantum computing, or what do you know about caching for inference or whatever? And then you're trying to say, well, if you can develop a network of engineers and product people inside the world's most advanced companies in this stuff, you can get to ground truth much more quickly than you could trying to be a generalist engineer who looks at everything. I'll often call Dylan to ask about things related to design or product, or, you might call, Luis at Duolingo, but to talk about education companies, or things like that. So you're really trying to build a network of collaborative people.
Okay, and if we take ourselves back to the framework that you laid out, which I love, so see, decide, win, build. Let's talk about building. Like, how do you ensure a company reaches its potential once you have got yourself involved and you're on the board and you've got a long road ahead of you and you hope it's successful? Like, what's the recipe to get them there?
Well, there's no recipe and there's no ensure. And I would say the other thing that's true is, as an investor, you have to develop a genuine humility, which is like, you don't matter that much. So I've been involved with Figma for probably 12 years now. And I really do try to be Dylan's first call, and I'm lead independent director now that we're public and that kind of stuff. But Dylan would have been successful whether I was involved or not. I'm very proud of the stuff that I've done, and I know that I've changed the course of things along the way. But Dylan was always going to run through walls and figure out how to make it work because of who he is and the entrepreneur he is. And so I think sometimes you get a little wrapped around the axle. It's like, well, what about my contribution and that kind of stuff? But like, the truth is, entrepreneurs are the sun, investors are the moon. So investors are only reflected light relative to entrepreneurs. And I really believe that. And I think that it's easy when you're talking about these huge amounts of money to get this turned around and say, oh, well, capital allocation is the main thing, but it's not. Like, building the thing is the main thing. And so what I would say is that you're making a decision early. I believe in this team and this mission and this project. And I'm going to try to figure out all the things that I can do to make that as successful as possible. But I'm involved in the project. It's not my project. The project is run by the team. And so when you start there, and it's like, well, I'm in service to the team. What can I do to help? And so for me, I can ask pointy questions. I can say, hey, this is great, but can you do it a little faster? Like, sort of silly, like, VC things are like, that's great, but can you do 10 times that much revenue? Like, dumb VC comments to say. But I can also recruit. I can get on the phone with people. I can say, I see a lot of companies, and this is the one that really makes sense because that compared to others, here are their metrics. And so you'd be crazy not to get on this rocket ship. Or I can introduce them to other people, or, I can do lots of things like that.
I like that. I like that idea of flexing to the founder, flexing to the business, and the point around humility, I have to say, is not what I was expecting to hear from a VC. So you've surprised me for the positive there. Maybe we should bring some of these investment stories to life. We've kind of teased a couple of examples already. Instagram, Figma. Can you talk us through those in terms of the growth story and any others that you think might be interesting for the listeners?
Of course. So Instagram was early in my career. It was 2 or 3 years in. And like I said, we'd been chasing Kevin for a little bit. And by the time he raised, he's like, okay, I'm ready to raise because the wheels are coming off the place. They're growing so fast. He came in, he pitched. It was not a unanimous decision inside our firm. We kind of decided to join hands with Sequoia and do it together. It took about 2 months to close. So what happens is you decide to invest, you give out a term sheet, you negotiate the terms with the founder, you give them a term sheet, you sign it, and then you do a bunch of legal diligence. And I mean, like always, the legal stuff takes all the time. So it takes like 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 months. And so it took us a month or two to close Instagram. We closed on a Thursday and we wired the check on a Thursday. And then by Monday, they announced they were getting acquired by Facebook for $1 billion. And so for us, that was a 2x return because we were investing at about a $500 million valuation. And so the 2x return in 4 days. And I remember getting a message from Dave Swenson, who famously ran the Yale endowment for years. And he kind of built this model where endowments invest in venture capital firms. And he's like, this is probably the best IRR ever, which IRR, internal rate of return. So the percentage that it grows, if you kind of doubling in 4 days is pretty good. If you could double your money every 4 days, you'd be in pretty good shape pretty fast.
If that compounded over even 1 year, then you'd be good.
Pretty good. But but it's a funny thing because once a year or so, firms have meetings with their limited partners. And, I got up in front of our limited partner not so long after that. And I said, look, this was a 2 times return quick. So I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm proud of it. But this is not the game we're playing. I'm not trying to do 2x return. I'm trying to do 100x return or 1,000x return. So the game wasn't to sell Instagram for $1 billion. The game, we really felt like this was going to be a multi-tens of $billion company. At some level, it's a success. At some level, it's a failure. And like a lot of things, it's all like that. So right now, compared to early investments in OpenAI or Anthropic, everything looks like a failure because those companies have shot up so fast over the years. But for me, it was a good journey and a good lesson.
Could you have known, John, that it was gonna? I mean, could you have done anything different in that instance?
No, I mean, Kevin was doing all the right things. And this is one where you had a very aggressive and smart CEO in Mark Zuckerberg
Hmm.
who could see a threat coming and figure out what to do about it
Hmm.
very early. And he just did the right thing. And like, almost everyone told him he was overpaying for Instagram at the time at $1 billion, maybe.
Imagine now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Instagram now I think is a lot of Facebook's value,
Yeah.
and so in retrospect, very clearly a good deal, and a good deal for Kevin and Mikey too, because they were it was a small company, 13 people growing, but they were growing very fast. So it's one of those things where it made sense for Facebook, made sense for Instagram, and it was fine for early investors. Like Kevin said the same thing. It's like you guys just doubled your money, you'll be fine. Like no crying.
Why did they take investment from you 4 days before they sold themselves to Facebook?
Well, we talked about the gap between when you agree to terms and when you wire the money because there's legal diligence and all this other stuff. And so we had agreed to terms maybe 6 weeks before that.
Okay, so they were just keeping their options open, and then the timing fell in a way that was. I assume that's fairly atypical.
No, they were just building the company. They knew they needed capital. They were building the company. And the thing about compounding viral networks is they grow fast. And so Instagram went from adding a few 100,000 users a day over the 6 week period where we were in diligence, like to adding 1 million users a day because they just launched Android and it just really inflected.
In that exact 6 weeks between when you agreed the investment and got through the diligence.
Exponential curves are funny because they look like they have a knee, but they're smooth because they're accelerating the whole way. But it turns out they launched the Android app in that period, and that really jacked the network effects up. And so everything started going faster. And then I think Facebook probably had been thinking about it earlier because they could see the very early signs of it. But then the numbers became kind of undeniable during that period.
Interesting. Okay, and I assume the Figma story is a little bit different.
Figma story was real different. So I met Dylan. I said no. Another firm called Index Ventures, a guy named Danny Reimer did their seed. And then it took a year and a half of relationship building with me and Dylan and them kind of doing exploration and finding a product that made sense. And then eventually they said, here's what I think we're going to do. It was still hard to see the market because in 2014, when we invested, there probably weren't enough designers in the world to support a multi-billion-dollar company like this. And so we kind of had to squint to see it. You really wanted to bet on Dylan and Evan and the team. And it's a sector that design is one that I care about a lot. It's changing now with AI for sure. And so we invested in 2014, and it was still 3 years after that before we really came to market with the product. Whereas Instagram, we invested in the thing was like adding 1 million users a day. Figma didn't really have any customers for a couple of years after I invested.
And in that time period, you're coaching, you're there, as you said, like you're there on the boat with them. It's just a little bit of a different velocity of journey.
Yeah, although at that stage, it's an interesting one because like there's stuff you can do, but the team's got to do the work. And there's a lot of like wandering around to try to figure out what the product should be and a lot of talking to customers and a lot of stuff that they just have to do. And so for investors, before you've got product in the market, there's a little bit you can do and you can help recruit and kind of nudge, but mostly you should leave them alone, in my view.
Okay, so a lot of trust.
Yeah, developing trust, yeah.
Developing trust. Okay, and we love to talk about AI on the Tech Overflow podcast, and I imagine that's really changed the game for you. Like, did you see that coming long before the rest of us did? And how has that changed things, both in terms of how you're looking at companies and also how you're coaching the companies that you're invested in?
Yeah, it's changing everything. I would say that like more has changed over the last even like 200 days than I think probably any other time in my career. I'm an old guy now. I'm 55, and so like I've seen a fair amount of stuff. Like I just can't remember any time it's changed like this. I would say that 2 or 3 years from that ago, it was obvious that LLMs in particular, large language models in particular, that OpenAI and Anthropic are built on were interesting and useful. It was not clear to me that they were going to be transformative, certainly not like they have been. I mean, it was even maybe just a year or two ago, people were debating whether these things could take over search, like from Google. And it's 100% obvious now that they can.
Yeah, well, we talked about this on a recent episode. Like, if you'd even said that, as you say, even 6 months ago for me, I would have been like, nah. And then now I don't use Google. I go to ChatGPT for everything.
Yeah, it's really shocking to me. And then really it's the last 200 days since Claude launched Opus 4 4.6. That was the first thing, the one that could code. And now, I've coded more in the last 2 months than I have in 30 years.
Wow.
I'm building products. And so it's like, for me as a product person, it's been so empowering to be able to say, oh, I think this thing should exist. Let me go play with it for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a complete reinvention of just about everything in software. And so I teach a class at the business school at Stanford, and we had a class yesterday, and we're like, this is the best time ever to be an MBA student, because like before it would be, well, I have this idea and I got to go across the street to engineering and find some computer scientists to try to
Right.
prototype it for me.
Mm-hmm.
And now if you can't prototype, like, you shouldn't be starting a company, because like it's just right there for you. If you can describe it using Figma Make or Claude, whatever, you can see it. You can build it in real life and see what it's going to feel like. And then you can go talk to customers and you can get real feedback in the loops. And so that changes just about everything. And it's just shocking to me how fast it's turned. So we're seeing lots and lots of startups. I'm in a new place now called Gigascale Capital, and we're mostly doing sort of energy and hard tech type things. It's a little harder to vibe code like a nuclear power plant or a like electrical transformer.
For now, anyway.
For now, yeah. But even those industries, I think, are already impacted by what you can do, especially with coding.
And I was going to ask you about the next quote unquote AI, but if this is the thing in however many years that you've seen that's changed the game, maybe there'll be another one, but perhaps not for a while. But how do you, I guess the theme there is like, what is disruptive and enduring? Like, how do you think about other potential big shifts in industries when it comes to placing sort of midterm bets in companies?
Look, I think a lot of people say this is going to happen or that's going to happen, or like it's super obvious that this is going to happen. And I think most people don't know. I think the future is fundamentally, it's all to play for, basically. This particular generation of AI has been a huge set of changes. I think we'll see more technological change. I think we'll see more technological advancements that we can't predict kind of come out of nowhere in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I think right now we're in a large deployment phase, which is like there's lots of things you can do that really make meaningful, better experiences, products, whatever, with this current generation of technology. And so we're seeing everyone deploy it all at once, and that's going to lead to shortages. It's going to lead to shortages in compute. It's going to lead to shortages in power, all up and down the stack. And so that's a lot of stuff that I think about now, which is like, what happens when you run out of inference? What happens when you run out of power? What happens when you run out of transformers? What happens when you run out of chips, or the chips run too hot? And so we're now going to be in a phase where I think demand is going to significantly outstrip supply. And so that will cause a whole bunch of optimizations and a whole bunch of like supply chain changes over the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. And as you're going through those optimization and deployment phases, I think other people will be innovating in sort of less sexy, less interesting parts of the world, and they'll surprise us. And so I think technology
to solve those problems. Like, do you mean that they'll be innovating to solve? No, okay.
No, what I mean is like there'll be people who say, look, okay, that's interesting, but like I'm kind of curious about these other things. I'm kind of curious about quantum or photonics. I'm curious about nuclear fusion or whatever. And that's the best thing about entrepreneurs is like they go kind of like, it's like, I wonder about this. And the best ones are like, not, I wonder about this thing because I saw it in the news yesterday and it seems like oil might be expensive because we're at war with Iran. Like that's easy to look at and say. The more interesting ones are like, oh, I wonder why is it that like we can't solve this problem? Like, let me go think about that for a little while. And the best ones are like working on projects that are different and interesting and like they'll surprise us. So I think this wave has been building for a long time, but it's pretty surprising that large language models have had this much ability to really change the world. So I think there'll be more of those things. I think more waves. And so durable, not durable, those are aspirational attributes that you try. And there are some things, we'll need power, we'll need chips, we'll need machines, and you'll need software. But at some level, you just try to do the best you can, try to figure things out and bet on the best people you can, and then just help them be as good as they can be.
And are you thinking about sort of future global challenges? Are you seeing much in the climate tech space? Because we get a lot of questions about that from the listeners, climate tech.
Yeah. So the firm I just announced last week or the week before that I'm a partner, advisory partner at a firm called Gigascale Capital. My close friend, Mike Schreffer, who was a longtime CTO of Meta. He's built this firm that's doing climate. He started as climate investing, but now he kind of more broadly, we're doing power, energy, supply chain, materials, sort of all the things that are important for keeping the world a habitable place. But obviously data centers and AI are pulling a lot of that stuff now. And so we're looking at everything kind of related to that as well. So I think there's a lot happening here. I think it's moved from being like, let's save the planet to how do we become more competitive in a challenging world. And so I think that as we move from competition and focus on materials and choke points and what are the things you need to have some access to be successful, I think that's where a lot of the interest is coming. But we still have a climate mission too. We need to keep the planet cool.
And do you feel optimistic about that with what you can see?
I am a technology optimist. I believe that humans almost always create challenges and they almost always solve challenges. And so we're going to create a whole bunch of new challenges with AI and data centers and all that stuff. And I think we'll solve them.
Okay, that's reassuring. And let's finish with another great story if you've got one. Is there anything else you can share? Do you have a worst investment, for example?
Well, I have lots of worst investments. Like a lot of my investments went to zero. We just shut down a company last week. So those are always hard because, you're in the boat. You're with the entrepreneur, and it's harder for them than as an investor, obviously. So I've got lots of those. They're all kind of interesting stories and not interesting stories. Hard to know. I would say I just think the most interesting things are always the things that surprise you. Like Instagram really changed the world. Figma's really changed the world. Duolingo, which I'm on the board of now for 5 years probably. But I passed on Duolingo's business probably, which meant I didn't invest in them. They pitched me and I didn't invest in them probably 5 times at Greylock because I just didn't think the business was very good and very interesting. And then they turned out to be fine. But, we built a relationship over time and eventually Luis called and said, hey, we're building a bigger board. Would you be on it? And so I think the main thing I would say to anyone is relationships are the thing. Like the companies that I turned down or turned down me or, life is long. And best thing about Silicon Valley is you can mix and remix and there'll be new people who come up and new people who do stuff that you haven't met before. And if we can all just try to focus on how do we help each other be good and interesting and do interesting stuff, things tend to work out.
Okay. And if the listeners are interested in seeing more, taking us back to that framework, you obviously live in the Valley and you're exposed to that by nature of course your job, but also I just imagine that there's a lot more of that in the mix with folks who live there. But if you're not in a hub of development, are there newsletters? Are there people that you can follow? How can we stay turned on to the changes that are coming and the exciting things that might be happening?
A lot of the interesting work is still happening on what I call Twitter, what people call X now. I wish it was a little more politically palatable than I think it is, but a lot of people are there, and I think a lot of the action happens there. And I still look at it most days. The great thing about now in 2026 is most people are doing all this experimenting in public, and so you can go read people's blogs about I'm using Claude Code for this, or I'm using Codex for this, or I'm using Gemini for this. And I would just say read as much as you can and try not to get super whiplashed about what's possible or what new release any of these labs came out with yesterday. But mostly people should think about what's the product and what's the thing that they want to see in the world. I think I might want to do this, and then try to figure out how to build it, because mostly the tools are showing up now to let you build stuff. Now it's becoming more about what's your intention? What do you want? What do you want the world to look like? Then you can figure out the how.
Okay, John, well, thank you so much for your time today. On behalf of me and the listeners, that's been super interesting, very insightful, and also quite inspiring. I need to go and figure out which problem I'm going to solve with my new relationship with Claude Code.
It's a good thing to think about. I've had a really good time. Thank you so much.
Well, and when I come up with that idea, I've got your email now, so I will be in touch.
That'll be great. I'll watch for it.
Okay, super. Thanks, John.
Well, thanks to John and thanks to Hannah for a great conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. The stories about Instagram and Figma were two of my favourites from this series. If you'd like to learn more about the Tech Overflow podcast, we are of course available on socials. You can find us on X, you can find us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, and LinkedIn. We also have our own website, techoverflowpodcast.com. And if you'd like to help the show, We'd love it if you'd share this episode and the podcast with your friends, colleagues, and family and get the word out about the show. Next week, Hannah and I will be back for a season wrap, and that'll be the end of season 2. We'll look forward to seeing you then.